Hello and welcome to the second talk in our Creole and Patois series here at Gŵyl Haf. Again, this is sponsored by People Tree Press. Today I'm speaking to Barbara Jenkins, who's the writer of two books, The Writer's Place and Sick Transit Wagon, a novel and a collection of short stories. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us.
This is an absolute delight. Thank you, Will. A
Thank
privilege too, yes.
Well, likewise, we feel the exact same. Similar to the talk with Desiree, and the way I open that, if people have watched that one already, one of the most sort of striking features of this book is the use of Trinidadian Creole. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about how you came to write in that. Sick Transit Wagon actually is published first and is in sort of standardized English, for want of a better phrase. How did you come to write the novel in Trinidadian Creole?
I'm surprised actually, Will, and delighted that you who are not West Indian, not Trinidadian, not even diasporian, you're able to recognize that there are Creoles in this text. How did I come to write it in Creole? Well, I think it is situated in a bar in Belmont. Belmont is a suburb of Port of Spain and a very old part of Port of Spain. And in Belmont, there is a mix of people, but it is a lower middle class area. And what they would speak is Creole. So I think the setting dictated what language should be used there. So the book itself is entirely in Creole, unless it is, or in one of the Creoles, unless it is in the head of the one character there who didn't grow up in Trinidad. And then in her head, she's in standard English, but everyone else speaks a kind of Creole depending on lots of circumstances. So I think the setting dictated the language that should be used in the book.
It's interesting that you talk about kind of not just Creole, but Creoles plural. Could you talk a little bit about actually just the variety of Creoles that exist in Trinidad? You and I on a phone call recently went a little bit into the history of Trinidad and how that's influenced the language. And for those that don't know, would you mind just going into the varieties, because it is as specific as which particular crop plantation you're working on, right?
Right, to a very large extent it is, yes. When Columbus arrived in Trinidad, he met people here already. The first peoples were here and they had their own language. Then Spanish was brought in. And everybody who was here, a very small population, spoke Spanish or a version of Spanish. Then we had the French arrive. The French arrived by invitation from the Spanish rulers. During the time of the French Revolution, people who lived up the islands who were French were invited to come to Trinidad, which was largely unpopulated at the time. They were invited to settle, provided they were white, Catholic, and swore allegiance to Spain. They were given huge grants of land, and the land they were given depended on who they were. Each man, woman, and child was given 32 acres, but also on the number of slaves they brought. So the enslaved people, by their very presence, earned land grants for their owners. And the population that arrived spoke French, or a kind of French that would have been mixed with African, the origin of the enslaved peoples. So we had those layers going on there, Spanish, French happening. If you were into cocoa in the valleys, there'd be kind of Spanish, French speaking. Then the British came, enslavement ended with emancipation, and they brought in people from British India, mainly from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. And they spoke Bhojpuri, which is a variant of Hindi. And they brought their own language. Now, unlike the enslaved Africans, the Indians were allowed to keep their language, their religion, their customs, and they were indentured. So they were going to serve for a period of time and perhaps go back, or given a grant of land to stay. So they had language retention there. But of course, they learned English, which was the way the colony at the time communicated. And from whom did they learn English? They learned English from the freed Africans who lived nearby. So Bhojpuri crept into the language, and English crept into the Bhojpuri. So this huge amalgam of location, origin, determined Creoles. Of course, additionally, you had class playing a huge role. The educated classes would speak a variety of English that would be more recognizable as standard English. And the lower orders would speak a Creole, and, depending on their class. I don't know if that answers your question fully enough, but there are many Creoles, and in De Rightest place, age, of course, plays a difference too. The older people would speak a Creole that was set in the 40s and 50s with a lot of French patois in it, and have a different vocabulary. Younger people would speak a different Creole that would have influences from American movies and from modern technology, language they pick up from texting, language they pick up from social media and so on. Yeah, so there are age differences in the Creole as well.
Thank you so much. I think it'd be hard for me to ask for a more kind of succinct and thorough answer than that. Yeah, thank you. And in De Rightest place, as you mentioned, there are so many kind of variations between characters, and it's a kind of identifier. We've spoken a little bit about how you can identify characters because it's a polyphonic book. There are times when you're not sure who the I is through the context, but you can identify that person through the language they use. And so Icynthia, for example, uses a lot of French patois in the way that like Jason doesn't. And this is a kind of key differentiator for the reader.
Yes, again, you've got an age difference there. And you've also got a place where the language is grounded. But apart from each character coming with their own language, with their own form of Trinidadian Creole, what they're saying in their heads is not necessarily what's coming out of their mouths, because when they're speaking to others, you adjust what you're saying to the ear of the person, your listener, and you also adjust it to the circumstances in which you find yourself. So you then get a complication of somebody's in their head and in their voice. And I think it could be complicated too by my absolute refusal to use inverted commas. So you're not sure if they're speaking aloud or if they're speaking in their head, but the identifier is the Creole that they're using.
Yeah,
I hope.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that was completely my experience. And it's just interesting as well, because the language is, there's a sentence that you and I have spoken about on 2 or 3 occasions now, where Icynthia says it's the burden of history that's real hard to put down. And that history is so present. All of the kind of the things you're saying about sort of invasions and colonization, but then also you mentioned the other night about how Portuguese communities and Chinese communities have come as well. All of this history exists in the language.
Yes, yes, and in practices that infuse language as well. For example, ceremonies and culinary arts, the food that people eat, because that I think that is one of the strongest retentions of any group that has merged into any mainstream culture. Food, I believe, food and religious practice are probably those that are held on longest in any amalgamation that may take place. And so food and religion have remained very, very strong among the groups. And so the terms that you use for example, let's take a baked stone, you know, a flat thing that you put on heat to bake something, right? You'd probably call it a baked stone, I don't know. My mother would call hers a platine. That is from her French background. She'd call it a platine. And I grew up calling it a platine. But when East Indian food and culinary practices infused Trinidad as it has, they call it a tawa. And now I call that a tawa. So language changes. Yes, so Icynthia, who is my age, may have said platine, but probably now say tower. And the same thing goes for vegetables. Again, I'm onto food a bit here, but you go into a market, you would ask for aubergine or eggplant, and I would ask for melangen, and the vendor would say baigan if he's East Indian. So we have this multiplicity of understandings as well as speaking.
And that, again, is all reflected in the book. There's an awful lot to do with the language of community, the language of gossip, the language of... one of the things I thought was really interesting, which is only available to a kind of polyphonic book and a book with this multiplicity of perspective and perspective on language, is betrayal and forgiveness. And there's a lot of betrayal and there's a lot of forgiveness done by the reader, I suppose. I don't want to give the game away for those that haven't read the book, but there is this kind of misunderstandings that are only accomplished through language, right?
Yes, yes. And I think that is really culturally Trinidadian. Often we say things in the heat of the moment, which under sober reflection, we may not have. And friendships can break because of that. Often the enmity can harden, but in a community like the one in which the Rightest place is located, the other people forming the community would make an effort to heal breaches, so that if there is misunderstanding, if there is a conflict of any kind, they would come in. I think they regarding the community as being bigger than the individual. To secure the community, people would rally together to heal rifts, and they would keep secrets for one another too.
And they do. And of course, it's set in a bar, and maybe forgiveness is a little bit more easy after a couple of drinks.
This is true. This is true, and I think it is used effectively there as well as in any real life bar.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to return to something that you said earlier about how you don't have any punctuation. You hate the inverted comma. Obviously, the book is punctuated, but you don't like the kind of the punctuation when a letter has been dropped, for example.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. I find, particularly in the setting of a bar where people are speaking, a lot of different people are speaking, and people are speaking in their heads as well as openly. Inverted commas would be very distracting, and then you've got to put he said and she said and this kind of thing. And I think for the flow of what is happening, I would like the reader to pick up as if it was live, voices coming from all sides, but distinguishable from one another based on the kind of Creole that they're using, or what they're actually saying in response to something. Additionally, this thing you raised about a letter being dropped, that too, I have tried to avoid. I think if you're reading and there are syntax markers that we're in the Creole, like the part of a verb missing, like he looking for instead of he is looking for. As soon as you see a marker like he looking for with the is missing, you know you're in a Creole space. So I don't then find it necessary to change a word from its correct English spelling to indicate, so that a Creole reader can say, let's say, he is looking for them. And I write, he looking for them, with the THEM. A Creole reader would not read them. A Creole reader would read, he looking for them, even though on the page it says THEM, because the Creole reader will have picked up that it is Creole by that syntactical marker, I hope.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, it kind of goes back to a similar conversation that I had with Desiree in the previous talk about how the language actually imposes things on you as a writer. You've made syntactical decisions, but you've made them because of a language that is kind of bigger than the novel and bigger than your
Yes.
kind of control of it as a writer, as an author.
Yes, yes. I'm glad that Desiree raised that with you or discussed that with you, because you have now come to me with all of this foreknowledge. Thumbs up, Desiree.
Yeah, I owe her a lot. You know, it's a fantastic talk. If anyone hasn't seen it yet, go and have a look, because she's fantastic. Yeah, fantastic. Well, listen, why don't we listen to some of what we've been talking about?
Okay.
We were going to do a short reading of the very first section from the book. So I'll hand over to you, and you can take it away whenever you're ready.
Right now, I'm reading from the book, so I'm going to be kind of sideways. That's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. Okay. This is the prologue, as it were, where we establish who is going to be the main narrator of the story, and her name is Icynthia. And she's Icynthia, the Belmont Mako. Now, maybe I need to explain Mako. A Mako is usually a woman who takes upon herself to be the informal newspaper of the community. That is, she's somebody who minds everybody's business. Okay, she doesn't often report on what she has seen or what she knows, but she's the repository of all the goings on. Okay, so here she says who she is. And oh yes, I will add that she is the oldest person in the novel. She is somebody around about my age, I suppose, entering 80s very shortly. So that in this first bit, she's talking about her own birth. So I may be placing this a long time ago, the early 40s. So the language is the sort of language that would have been around in the early 40s. On the day I born, overhearing the rediffusion that the neighbor turn up full blast so that the whole yard could enjoy his good fortune, he being the onlyest person in the yard to have radio. My mommy hear a nice song she never hear before, and it go like this. Who is, what is she? This is all she make out of the name, because right at that instant, Dudu, Martinican Poatique, bawl out from the lane, Provision frais. Mommy rush outside. She have to choose plantain to pong and dashing to boil and fresh seasoning to put on the curry she buy from the fishman the same morning self. The first belly pain slam, whatam! And his radio neighbor self who have to run to the lane to get Nurse Brooks. Nursey rest, she two hand flat on top my mommy stretch out belly. She feeling round and round, she ain't saying nothing. My mommy, I have no experience in these matters. But when she's seeing how Nursey only shaking she head, how she only pushing out she mouth, mommy sensing things must be not right. Nursey saying to the radio neighbor, you stay right here. Then she say, this looking like real trouble. She tell him, do quick and run up by the circular road. We get a car. This is colonial hospital business. See the three women park up outside on the road, waiting for radio neighbor to come back with the car. Do, marchand, market basket balancing on she head, shifting from foot to foot. She don't know how to leave. She don't know how to stay. Nurse Brooks, big, black midwife bag in tight grip, head jerking left to right to left, like a frightened chicken looking to get on the other side of a busy road. And my poor mommy, she prop up on the galvanized fencing. She two hand holding up she belly like if it's a big heavy pumpkin she carrying and she afraid to drop it and it busts open. Oh God, she saying. She bending over. Oh, merciful Father in heaven, she bawling. She squatting down on the road. She calling, Jesus, Mary, Joseph. Now it's only a whisper, oh God, oh Lord, oh God. And with that, I step out, foot first, right there on the road. Right on the crossroad, right under issue watching eye. Yes, issue self looking on me as my 2 foot touch the pitch road. Watch me, I ready to travel. I ready to carry news. I ready for the road.
Thank you, and yeah, I hope that gave people sort of some kind of taster of what you're in for with this book, and in particular, Icynthia's voice in that. There's something in the very last section there that I wanted to sort of touch on, which is Ishu looking on. We've spoken a little bit about kind of colonial influences on the Creole language, but obviously there are also African languages that have an influence as well. And yeah, I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, and a little bit about, and we spoke as well about, I suppose, indigenous languages indigenous to Trinidad pre-Columbus. If you could speak a little bit about how those languages feature in some kinds of Trinidadian Creole today.
Right. In terms of the first people's languages, I don't know very much about that, but the retentions are there in place names. So that actually Trinidad is an amalgam of place names from different places. So the first people's place names would be things like Chagaramas, Maracas, Arima. And then you have Spanish place names as well, like Diego Martin, where I live, Diego Martin. There's La Pastora. And then you have lots of French place names like Blanchisseuse, Petit Valley, which is the neighboring valley to Diego Martin. So you've got lots of place names that are relics of languages that were spoken here. And then you have the strange thing like some Spanish names spoken with the French way. There is a little town just east of Port of Spain called San Juan, Sanjuan, the Spanish word San Juan, like in Puerto Rico, right? We pronounce it San Juan as if it's a French word, which is weird. And then you have the ridiculous thing of the capital being called Port of Spain, an English word that is referencing a past. So there is a lot of this kind of presence and masking, as it were, happening in place names. With respect to the original question, which was about language retention, in the case of Africans, regrettably, Africans came from many, many different places. And because we are looking here, certainly in the Rightest place, as very many generations down from the original arrival, we are not going to find many words. But the issue referenced in the beginning there is to do with a different retention, which is religion, which we mentioned before, particularly with respect to the East Indian population. African religions were banned. African music was banned. You couldn't play drums. It was against the law to drum. And actually that has been quite fortunate because it led to a lot of innovation in music, from the skin drum that was forbidden. Trinidadians went on to cutting lengths of bamboo to make the kind of resonances that a drum would make. And then they moved on to using steel drums that were discards from the oil field to make music with harmony and melody and everything in it. So sometimes repression is helpful in innovation. You know, what is it? Necessity is the mother of invention. Yes, certainly happened with our music. But to go back to African languages, religion had to be masked so that the Catholic gods, or saints, sorry, Catholicism has one God, a Holy Trinity and all that stuff. Sorry, Catholics, the Catholic God and the Holy Trinity and the whole panoply of saints took on for Africans a mask. They had a mask to hide their own gods behind. So a sort of a syncretic religion arose, which was also banned. Shango and Orisha and those religions were banned, but you could practice it behind the mask of the Catholic gods. Does that help?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
I'm straying.
Incredibly detailed answers, and then saying, "Is that enough? Is that enough information?"
Well,
Yeah,
you know, I'm sorry, I'm wandering off.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Tangents, yes.
Not at all. It's interesting the way that religion and language, because you mentioned syncretism, and obviously, you know, patois are common across, and Creoles are common across the Caribbean, you know, and syncretic religions are as well. You know, you look at Cuba, but you also look at kind of Bahia state in Brazil, and all across the Caribbean, these things have been, again, through necessity, you know, changed and modified, and in many senses, I suppose, familiarized to a kind of ancestral, previous generation practices, effectively. And
yes.
This is also present in the language.
Yes. Yes, I mean, there was a time when you could be arrested on the road if you were carrying a bottle of oil, a coquille broom, and some candles. If you were carrying those, a coquille broom, by the way, is a broom made out of the ribs of the coconut palm leaf. Okay, I've got one, but I'm not going to show you it. If you were found with with these on the road, the policeman arresting you would assume that you were about to go and do a forbidden African religious practice, that you were going to work obeah or you were going to practice Shango somewhere. So even innocent items like that in conjunction would together say something about malevolent intent.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is maybe a very tenuous link into this next part of the discussion, but I'd love to talk a little bit about Indira's love of the horoscope. And, you know, we were speaking the other night about kind of how does one anchor oneself. For many people, that's, you know, in a religion, whatever that might be. And for Indira, it's self-help books and horoscopes. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how that came to be a feature of her character.
Right, okay. Indira's backstory appears in two little bits somewhere, in Reflections or a Dream. It doesn't intrude into her conversation with anybody else. It's locked away in and just revealed, as I said, in a dream or in a private reflection. She was born in India to British parents around the time of Indira Gandhi's reign of terror. And her parents, young people, a young British couple, had gone off on a boat, and there was a storm and they were probably lost. So she was brought up by the Indian family who owned the guest house where they were staying. And she was given the name Indira because the family couldn't speak any English, but they could hear the young couple talking about Indira Gandhi. So they called the baby Indira. Okay, that's her backstory. But after growing up there, she was seized. She wandered into an orphanage where she was looked after by Catholic nuns, and then she was captured and sold into prostitution. She had a baby. The baby was taken away and put up for adoption, presumably, and then she was looked after, I suppose, by some kind of a sugar daddy. It's not stated in the novel, but you could kind of deduce that somebody looked after her, got her a false passport. She went to Europe where she blended, and then she met the man, Solomon, who brought her to Trinidad. Okay, now there is a woman who is completely unmoored. She has no real roots. She's gone from pillar to post all of her life. Everywhere she went and everything that happened to her was new, and she had to find some way of holding on to things. Lacking a particular religion, I saw Indira as somebody needing the kind of guidance that some people get when they read a Bible verse in the morning to focus themselves, or they do a yoga practice or something to get a hold of themselves for the rest of the day. She opened the horoscope in the newspaper and let that be her guide for the day. And this is bolstered by self-help books, which is a big thing among, I hesitate to say this, but among people who feel they have a need to better themselves. And so she reads self-help books and she reads the horoscope and is guided. The wonderful thing about horoscopes is that they predict in a way and they guide in a way, so that they kind of open to interpretation, and anything that happens to you during the day, you could tie back to the horoscope. Yeah, so I gave her these two things to hold on to so that she would feel connected with life and not feel drifting. When Solomon left her, she felt adrift.
You deal with them really nicely because there is you are taking the mick a little bit, especially with the self-help books and the very inventive titles of the self-help books. You've had a lot of fun writing those. But there's also a sincerity there as well, isn't there? There's also a kind of real, like you say, an anchoring that's also present in the community. Once she feels more anchored because of these horoscopes, she goes back to her local community. And I think this links into one of the kind of nice elements of this book, or one of the, I hesitate to call it like a fable or a parable, or like there's a message, but the way in which individuals can be really locally defined. They can be really defined by those closest to them, more so than other things, than parentage, or where she's been in her kind of life as a child in an orphanage, her life as an adolescent in Europe, or as a young adult in the UK, or as a kind of fully blown adult in Trinidad. What she comes to respond to and what she comes to define herself as is a member of this community in this bar in Belmont in Trinidad, and that's her anchor.
Yes, actually the strength of location in community belonging to a particular physical, geographical location, in this case, the bar, and also in this case, Belmont. I wonder how strong that is now, though, Will. Perhaps in a setting, in a pub that is a local pub that regulars frequent in the UK, you may get that sense of belonging to a community. But so many, let's say, pubs have now become eating places. They've opened up, haven't they? They've opened back now?
Yes, thankfully.
Yeah, right. And I think a lot of transients frequent these places now. So is there a sense of regulars using locals in the same way now? I'm not so sure. It is this exists, this particular the Rightest Place pub exists because the community still lives around the pub. But communities now, I'm not so sure communities now are as geographically located as they were. Your community, Will, is probably the people at work, perhaps, or the people in your social media network. You know, communities now have a different virtual existence. I mean, right now you're my community, Will. You and Caitlin are part of my new community, and I hope one day I meet you in the flesh, and there'll be a physical meaning to our relationship, to our friendship, to our community. But yes, I think I was trying also in locating this so tightly in a pub, in a geographical location. Perhaps it was my way of holding on to something that maybe I feel slipping away.
Well, yeah, because you mentioned in a previous interview that you firstly, you know someone who runs a bar in Belmont.
I
So
do.
you had an image of the Rightest Place, or what that might look like before you wrote the book. But you were writing the Belmont of your childhood in many ways. You were drawing on your memories.
Yes.
And on top of that, gentrification does loom in the background of this a little bit. You know, it does come up. There are little statements, very subtle asides, particularly towards the end of the book, that make it clear that actually the makeup is changing, that there are new developments going up, that Belmont is in some way irreversibly being lost, changed, whatever you want to call it, ruined, modernized.
Yes. I don't know if I'd want to use words like that. Ruined, maybe changed more than ruined. But then we've had this awful pandemic where you've become more acutely aware of where you are located. When you have a lockdown, when you have a curfew, you're physically grounded, so that you've really got to know who your neighbors are. You've really got to know who can look out for you, who can go and do your shopping for you. So that I think this has brought a quiet reversal, and I hope it lasts. So, and on another note, I'm not sure how much I would deplore change if it brings things like a higher standard of domestic living, where you have plumbing and running water and electricity and things like that.
Yeah, to be clear, to anyone who misunderstood me, I don't. That was a comment.
No, not at all. Yes, no, you're right. There is a lot of change, and when I went back there quite recently, a lot of the lovely old houses had been torn down. The lovely gingerbread houses had gone, and in their place, concrete structures with a I suppose a more secure footprint in the ground. but also requiring air conditioning, which the old houses with all the wood and opportunities for breeze passing through did not need. The so-called modernization has brought a lot of physical change, yes. And it has also brought I mean, I don't know if there are any macos in Belmont anymore. To be a proper maco, the physical place where you live has to allow it. You have to have a gallery in front of your house. That is like an open veranda. You've got to have windows that are open all the time onto the street. I will have you know that where I live now, although it is a modern building, I have a gallery and I have a window open onto the street. So to be a proper Mako, you need to be able to look out onto your street. If, however, you're entertaining spaces at the back, in a patio, by a pool, you have no idea what's happening on the street.
So just how autobiographical is Icynthia then?
I'm afraid not very much. She's more the sort of person that I would have known at a particular stage of my life. But I do recognize that a lot of what she does for the neighborhood by being alert and observant and reticent and tactful about what she knows, when that disappears, the fabric of the neighborhood unravels, the fabric of mutual support unravels. And when I talked about the architecture of the house no longer supporting that kind of activity, it is something that I personally deplore, that no longer have you got eyes on the road. So no, the autobiography comes later. I'm writing a memoir now. So,
Well, yeah, I was going to ask, before we get on to the memoir,
yeah.
you've spent some time in Wales. And the story of how you ended up in Wales is in itself quite remarkable. But you're sort of no stranger to Wales from a much earlier period in your life, an earlier period in your life. Do you want to tell that? I think that's a fantastic story. Personally, I love this story.
Oh, well, Wales, for me, it started in Trinidad. Went to school, did what was called higher certificate in those days, equivalent of A-levels now. And at that time, tertiary education, university was unthinkable for the mass of the population. 4 boys every year had the opportunity of a scholarship and 1 girl. I was not that 1 girl in my year. I was second. I went to work as a teacher in the school where I had been a student at a convent. And then when independent, that was in 1959, I did that higher certificate. Independence was looming. It actually happened in 1962 when Britain was shedding colonies, you know, like confetti all over the place. They decided that they should give some scholarships so that they would have qualified teachers in their schools, people with degrees. And I applied for one of the scholarships to study geography, to come back to be a geography teacher, which is what I spent my entire life doing. And when I went in to work out where I was going to go and study geography and get a degree, one of the places could not be UWI, the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, which was then University College, or College of London University. I couldn't go there, they weren't doing geography. So it had to be abroad. The man in charge said, do you want to go to the States or Canada or England? I said, England. And he said, right, this was England, got it? Not the UK. He said, okay, let's see where it does geography and you can choose where you want to go. Right? He opened this vast book and the list came down, alphabetically, but I wasn't aware of it at the time. Started Aberystwyth, Bangor, Cambridge, I thought, okay, it's going to eventually reach London, which I'd heard of. I'd heard of Cambridge, Oxford, and other places I'd never heard of. So I said, have you got a map? He said, yes. He pulled out a map. I said, let's see where some of these places are. We looked, and Aberystwyth on the sea, on the coast, was the one I chose. I didn't want to be far from the sea. Of course, I didn't picture sea to be the way the Irish Sea turned out. I pictured sea the way I knew sea. And I thought, oh, it'd be lovely to be by the sea. Of course, I was a geography student. I knew about climate. I knew that Britain has a cool, temperate, western margin kind of climate. I knew what that meant, but I'd never felt it. Anyway, I chose Aberystwyth. I got there eventually by ship to Southampton. I went on the French line on the SS Antille, arrived in Southampton, went to London, got a train to Aberystwyth, and heard people speaking a language I had never heard before. I loved it. I absolutely had the best time in Wales. I was born and I grew up in Trinidad, but I became me in Wales.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we were speaking about this the other night, is that I thought that I thought you were still spending time in Wales, because you have this Welsh lilt to your voice. You say certain words with an incredibly Welsh accent as I hear it, and I understand that to be a Welsh accent. But you were talking about the way that in Montserrat they sound Scottish, in Trinidad sound a bit Welsh.
Yes. Well, Jamaica is supposed to sound a bit more Scottish. Barbados is supposed to sound a bit like West Country. Montserrat, they say, sounds a bit Irish. Actually, Montserrat has a public holiday on St. Patrick's Day. A public holiday on St. Patrick's Day. Yes. I don't know how many Catholics live in Montserrat, but there you are. And Trinidad, people always say Trinidadians sound Welsh. So my Trinidadian accent was quite acceptable in Wales.
But again, it's this idea that an oral language, a vocal language, language in general, can never escape history, right? The reason that these Caribbean countries, the people in those countries sound like they might have an Irish accent or a Welsh accent, is because they were colonised by Irish people or by Welsh people or by people from Bristol or wherever. And this is an inescapable fact of language, that it contains your history, our history, whoever's, whether you know it or not.
Yeah. Colonized, I think more like controlled or ruled or administered. The British didn't do very much colonizing. They were merchants, and they were the governors and the people in the high levels of government. So it was more an administrative language than a colonizing in the sense of settler colonization language. So you got the English accent from the brand of English or Irish or Welsh or Scottish accent to your language from the administrative class, not from living among them. Living among them gave you living among different people gave you the vocabulary. So you got the vocabulary from the French or Spanish settlers, but the accent on top of that came from the administrative class. I'm only now thinking that through, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. And just finally as well, just a note on, you mentioned earlier that you were a geography teacher for your whole career. and you have been the author of 2 books in the last 7 years. Am I right? I think 7 years.
Yes. I think Sick Transit Wagon came out in 2013. Yeah. So it's a little, not too far off. Yeah.
Yeah. That in itself is a kind of amazing achievement. It's I think the creative industries, be it writing or acting or whatever, they're often thought of as being a vocation. And there's a kind of level of inaccessibility that is layered on top of them because it's thought of as being a gift or a kind of preternatural ability that you might be lucky enough to have. Obviously, your books contradicts that because you've been a teacher and now you're sort of writing. Could you talk a little bit about the kind of process of deciding to write first short stories and then a novel? And actually as well the evolution, because you have gone from 10, 15 page short stories into a 275 odd page novel.
Okay. So much in life has been accidental. I mean, I just told you the whole Aberystwyth story. And this too, my so-called writing life is an accident. I was a teacher all my life. My husband died when we were 53, which is, pretty young. The children, none of my children live here in Trinidad. I have 9 grandchildren, and 5 are in Canada, way over in British Columbia, and the remaining 4 are in the south of England, 2 in Brighton and 2 in London. So I don't have the sort of things that women my age have to keep them happy and grounded. Okay, so there's this void, there's this vacuum, which was very quickly filled by a couple of friends who all my life I've been an avid reader. So I belong to a book club. 2 book club friends decided they wanted to write and they wanted a third. They said, okay, would you join us? I said, okay. And we'd write little things and they were happy with it. And they said, why don't you show it to somebody, which I did. I showed it to a bit of writing to Nicholas Laughlin, who at the time was the editor of Caribbean Beat, and lovely young man, somebody that I didn't know in person then. And he liked them. And he said, why don't you enter the Commonwealth Short Story Prize? I mean, those days it was a little 600-word thing, not what it is now, I think 6,000 words. So I did. In 2009, I submitted something and it was shortlisted in the Caribbean region. In 2010, my next story won the Caribbean region. 2011, it won the Caribbean region. And then I started entering stuff, small acts, I won that. Caribbean Writer, my story won that. Wasafiri New Writing Prize, it won that too. And I thought, hey, something is happening here that I quite like. Everything that I sent in seemed to find favor with readers whom I didn't know, people who were all over the place. I found that very encouraging. And then I applied to something called the Cropper Foundation Creative Writing Workshop, a residential workshop for 3 weeks out in the northeast coast of Trinidad, and loved it. Had wonderful 3 weeks there. And what happened next? Oh yes, Bocas Lit Fest, our local literary festival, came to life in 2011, just about the time when I was tinkering with stories. And who should be there at the first Bocas Lit Fest than Jeremy Pointing, who is the managing director and founder of People Tree Press, who come all the way from Leeds to be at our inaugural literary festival. And there was something called the Emerging Writers lunchtime readings, and I read a little story there. And Jeremy is really wonderful, he makes himself so accessible. He was sitting in the audience as he does, like this, listening to everybody read their little offerings. He didn't say anything to me. I didn't say anything to him. I didn't contact him about anything. And then I decided, let me apply for the MFA at University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, got in there. And now I'm coming to the bit. One of the things you had to do to complete the MFA was to produce either a novel or a collection of short stories. And since I was not feeling that I knew enough about anything to attempt a novel, I thought I'd hand in a short story every couple of weeks to my professor and see if they find his favor, just as I'd been doing short stories for competitions before. And I built up a little collection of short stories. And when I graduated with the MFA, I said, okay, can somebody give me the email address for Jeremy Pointing? And sent it to him. And he took it. So without an agent, without all the usual things that people seem to need, like I said, it's luck. There was this wonderful, approachable, generous person willing to get unsolicited manuscript from unknown people by email and read it and say, yes, I'll take these stories. In the meantime, I had applied for something that Bocas Lit Fest was doing, which was the Holly Carbon Prize. And I won that. And as a gift, I was asked, I was given, it was the first time they were giving the prize, and they said, okay, you're going to get somebody to mentor you. Bring this little short story you had entered for the prize. Bring this to fruition in some way. Whom do you want? I said, well, I don't know anybody to mentor me. You choose. And they chose Bernadine Evaristo for me. And she was my mentor through the writer's space. I think I have been incredibly lucky.
You say that, but you don't get to those, you make your own luck in some regards, and they are fantastic stories, and it is a fantastic novel. And yeah, I mean, it's testament to an ability as well as luck. I'm a big believer in chance and in luck, but actually you could really see why these books aren't the result of luck, they're the result of hard work, and it seems to come very easy to you as well. You're sort of reeling off these prizes that you won, and it seems to be an incredibly pleasurable process for you to sit down and write.
Oh, absolutely. It's as pleasurable as reading. It's maybe when you've lived a very long time, you have a lot to say. I think you probably think I have too much to say after this interview. However, you have a lot to say, a lot has happened. Actually, the amount of research I've had to do for anything is so little, because when you've lived a long time, you've experienced a lot. And I think I have now, with what I'm currently doing, I'm trying to hold things before they get lost as memory begins to fade. So yeah, I think this is my last ditch effort to hold on to things before they disappear. This new work that I'm doing.
Yeah. Listen, thank you so much for this talk. It's been so enlightening and so great to speak to you, and thank you so much for coming on and speaking to us. And a big thank you as well to People Tree for sponsoring the talk. These are Barbara's books, Sick Transit Wagon and The Writer's Place. Thank you again for speaking to us.
Well, it has been an absolute delight. I wish we could go on for very much longer.
Yeah.
Have a great time at the festival. I'm so looking forward to a Welsh language festival.
Thank you. Yes, and actually, two final things to say. Do go and check out Bocas Lit Fest. Small festivals, go and look for them. Regional festivals, go and look for them. These are really run by people who are just passionate and who just love it. So yeah, go and look for Bocas Lit Fest. Finally, the Patreon link will be below. So if you're inclined, or if you're able to donate us any money, please do click the link below, and it will take you to our Patreon page. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us, and see you at the next talk.